here in the UK, as Beijing overseas influence operations have rapidly expanded, turning a blind eye to what the Intelligence and Security Committee termed penetration of every sector of the UK economy, unquote. Still, incredibly, there is a debate within the UK government, we understand, over whether or not China should be in the enhanced tier of the new Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. Still, the UK has yet to impose a single sanction on officials responsible for the destruction of freedoms in Hong Kong, despite the UK being one of the two duty bearers with China under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. I remind everybody that the United States, by contrast, in the same period, has sanctioned over 40 people in Hong Kong. We have sanctioned none. We must now enter a new era of relations with China, dealing with the contemporary Chinese Communist Party as it really is, not as we would wish it to be. And today's announcement should mark a watershed moment where the UK takes a stand for values of human rights and the international rules-based system upon which we all depend. And therefore we have, hopefully, 4 requests of the government when they get up to make their respective statements today. Number 1, that China should immediately be labelled as a threat, not as an epoch-defining systemic challenge in the integrated review. 2, China should be in the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, that there should be sanctions on those who are responsible for the abuses, not just in Hong Kong, but obviously in Xinjiang and around the whole of China's suzerainty, including Tibet, of course, and support for MPs and other victims of Beijing's transnational repression. Thank you very much indeed. Questions? Shall we start left and right and we can pick them up? Yep.
Thank you.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Sharing mics.
Thank you, Andy Bell, 5 News. David Cameron is now the Foreign Secretary. He was the man who led the drive for the so-called golden era with China. Do you feel complete confidence that he's the man to push ahead with what you believe needs now to happen with the UK's attitude?
Well, I don't know if my colleagues should start answering as well. So, Tim, do you want to say something about it?
I think there has been a change in tone from the government since David Cameron has arrived. Whether that's him trying to overcompensate from being the architect, along with George Osborne, of the golden era, I don't know. But the events that have happened in the last few days and what is going to be announced later on today by the Deputy Prime Minister point to a very clear malign influence by China. And in the past, I know David Cameron and others have always stressed getting a balance between trading opportunities with the world's second largest economy and the risks for security and their abuses of human rights. I think that the news and the statement we're going to get later about potential attacks that there have been, the press are recording against the Electoral Commission, we'll hear more about that later, and what has been going on against parliamentarians, show that the dial has very much swung towards the risk category away from the opportunities category. And I hope David Cameron, when he presumably responds to this in the House of Lords himself, will acknowledge that. And I think that would certainly chime with the feeling of parliamentarians on both sides of the House as to how we view China.
Yeah, I think there's just another thing to say here. I mean, the focus obviously is on David Cameron as the Foreign Secretary. I get that. But there was a consensus 10, 12, 15 years ago across politics, across business, across academia, that this was a good thing. This golden era was a good thing. What we now need is a new consensus that, as we've said, deals with China as it is. What it's doing domestically, but also what it's doing here to parliamentarians elected by members of the public to represent them. But also what's happening to Hong Kong dissidents in this country as well, and others who are being persecuted and targeted. I've been here before, but with Russia. So I know what this is like. And what we need to see is the same kind of urgency to develop a new consensus that deals with China as it is, not as this kind of sweet meal that we can try and milk and only get the good parts when we're very much not just getting the good parts.
Can I just get to the other hands came up and then we can come back quickly because while you get the microphone moved across there and then back at the BBC. Okay, well, yeah. Libby, yeah.
The fact is that the trade between Britain and China is now worth something in the region of £100 billion. Are you saying to the government that they need to think again as to whether we should leave our economy that exposed in terms of whether we can actually protect our citizens at the same time?
Can I?
Yeah, you far away.
This threat about the impact it will have on countries' trade if they dare to stand up and call out China's abuses is a fiction. Every country which has done that has actually seen subsequently an increase in its trade with China. The only time we saw a downturn in trade with China in the UK was in about 8 or 9 years ago, in the midst of the golden era. It is a complete fallacy that if you call out China, instantly all the trade and investment opportunities dry up.
Briefly, Iain Duncan Smith, if I can ask you, as a former leader of the Conservative Party, whether you think Britain's democracy has actually been compromised by this mass cyber attack?
Well, there's no question that's what those malign entities would want it to happen. If you ask me, have we been fast enough and quick enough and focused enough to deal with it, the answer has to be no. Not for want of trying by the security services, I have to tell you, because I think they've been well aware of what this was. I go back to 2020 when some of us opposed the entry of Huawei into 5G. I thought the government received bad advice about that, as to whether you can control it. Eventually, we were able to demonstrate that was not the case, and it was politicians, parliamentarians, that actually opposed that and stopped it. So what we've hoped for ever since is that that should not be the case. Most of us were sanctioned, those of us were sanctioned, because we had unearthed the Xinjiang genocide. And it is a genocide. Even the UN have suggested that that is necessarily the case. Because we got that to everybody around the world, these were official documents, China was furious with those of us as individuals as well. And even though the government sanctioned 3 very lowly officials, they went ahead and sanctioned 10 of us, including 1 legal chambers. So the reality is even the balance isn't correct right now, so it needs to be reset. But certainly we need to be much stronger and tougher. And if you're tough with people, the lesson we learned from the 1930s, appeasement never works. If you're strong, you tell them what's wrong, and you tell them you're not going to put up with it, then eventually they will probably back down. But if you don't, they just keep taking advantage of you, and that's our biggest problem. Yes, and then the BBC.
Okay, Beth, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth Rigby, Sky News. Just a couple of questions, if I may. The first one, when you talk about resetting relations or a new watershed moment, you also suggest there are still divisions within government about the direction of travel. Is the Prime Minister on the wrong side of that, given it is he today who talked about an epoch-defining challenge rather than explicitly saying China's a threat? Can you flesh that out a bit? And for all of you, this has been going on for some time for all of you, and the Electoral Commission attempts of cyber attacks happened back in 2021-22. It's only now that the Prime Minister is moving on it. And if I may, is there an element too here of party politics for a Prime Minister that is struggling with his backbenchers? He's been in a row about Rwanda, and he's trying to perhaps bring this now, why now, in order to perhaps unify the party a bit going into recess? Is there domestic politics at play here?
No, I don't think it's the way you say it at all. I wouldn't, in your latter question, I certainly wouldn't think that that would be the case, because I think most MPs are already clear that China is a threat. I mean, we don't go around in the tea rooms talking to each other about, my gosh, have you seen how how challenging they are in an epoch sense over a cup of tea with each other? What we talk about is the threat. So the question really is, what kind of advice is the government getting on that? And we need to, as they say, call a spade a spade. And the reality is that they are a threat. They're a threat to, I mean, you talk to businesses, a lot of medium businesses are moving out of China now because they get their IP stolen and they can't deal with them. The legal system around them doesn't work. So they're beginning to move away. I noticed that Apple moved their telephone manufacture to India because they're now beginning to worry about it. This is only damaging to China at the end of the day. So we should stand up, call them what they are, and then say, if you deal with us, you deal with us on the basis that we don't fully trust you.
But just to follow up on that,
I was just going to come forward.
What you said that there are still divisions within government. in your statement about how to deal with this threat?
Well, inevitably, otherwise we would have an absolute settled order, and we don't. But it's not about the divisions that I'm after. These are arguments and debates about how far do you go, which is quite normal, I think. The question really is for us, it is really now time for us to recognise, particularly with what we may well be seeing concerning the Electoral Commission stuff, that they have a malign influence, and therefore they have become a threat. And I think it's time we call them that. I don't know if you
Can I add to that? If you remember, when we had a vote in Parliament on genocide, it was unanimous. There's no division amongst parliamentarians, and it's not a party political matter. Where there is, I think, still a grey area is the attitude of the Foreign Office in particular, which doesn't like to rock the boat on these matters, and how much ministers may challenge that. Hopefully now ministers will challenge that much more readily. To go back to your earlier point, and this is a question for the Deputy Prime Minister this afternoon and for press as well, is for attacks which may have happened back in 2021, there now is going to be action 2.5, 3 years later. And certainly that remains something of a mystery to us. And what pressure there have been from some of our Five Eyes partners and others where there have been more recent attacks, and they've responded rather more speedily. So that is certainly a challenge of the government. Why it's taking so long, it would appear, for this now to be acted on.
Yeah.
The point is,
I got one in the back, actually.
The party can at least unify around this issue behind the Prime Minister in some way.
Well, all we're saying is that the Parliament is united already, and it's self-evident, really, that is the case. And we just therefore want the government to take the right action. They are a threat. We ought to call them a threat, and that then populates all the other arguments that take place inside Parliament. Paul Mason.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Chris Mason from BBC News. Could you set out, in as precise terms as you can, what you have had to put up with as individuals? You talked to Iain about impersonation, attempted hacking. I was interested to hear precisely how it has been for you. And then just one additional question. So Iain, you made a comparison a few moments ago with the 1930s. That's obviously a stark comparison. Is that the scale of the threat that you see in terms of the threat the UK faces from China, that comparison with nearly a century ago?
Well, let me start, because the others will obviously have their own views. Personally, I've had a wolf warrior that was impersonating me for some time, using a fake email address, emailing all sorts of politicians around the world, saying that I'd recanted my views, also saying basically that I was a liar, all these sort of things to various people. I only came to know about it because I know some of them, and they were sending this back to me to say, why are you sending me emails recanting and basically calling yourself a liar? And I was able to explain to them it's not my email address and it's not me. I won't say what happened, but eventually he went quiet. We did know where he was in due course. But so that's one of the things. The other thing is we know that many of us have had hacking attempts, some fairly shallow attempts, but nonetheless hacking, and some more serious. So those are the experiences. I'm not alone in those personal experiences, but the others too. I don't know whether
Stewart,
you, of course, have this whole experience with Russia as well.
Yes, I was here about a year ago with Russia, where the bit that doesn't get talked about in the parliamentary state and the targeting of Parliament is the staff front. It doesn't get talked about enough. And when I was targeted by Russia a year ago, that was via a member of my staff. But I want to address your point on the scale of the challenge. When I talk about the need for this new consensus, I mean, this affects every single part of our society. It would be wrong to see this as just a faraway foreign policy issue. This is about our energy sector, it's about our economy, it's about our universities, it's about our political system, our critical national infrastructure. It goes into everything. And, you know, if I can tap onto Beth's question, at least the Tories are having this discussion in robust terms. Politics has got so much catching up to do, and Iain is right. Industry and business is further ahead than government and politics in general. We're already seeing de-risking or decoupling, however you want to phrase that, happening. Politics and the institutions of politics and government badly needs to catch up, because not only will this keep happening, it will get worse and worse and worse, and we can't let that happen.
Can I, just to get back to it, and tomorrow is the third anniversary of when 7 parliamentarians were sanctioned, which we found out of the blue. We were never actually written to individually by the Chinese Communist Party government saying, "Dear Mr. Lawton, we're just dropping you a note to say you've been sanctioned." We were told that involves ourselves and our families unable to travel to China and Hong Kong. Our business assets seized, and we're not allowed to do business, which is academic, I think, for all of us. Over that last 3 years, various colleagues who aren't here as well have had hacking attempts, a lot of impersonation. I'm constantly getting emails or tweets from Tom Tugendhat saying he has resigned in disgust at the government's policy on such and such, for example. Yesterday we had a tweet from the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Human Rights Commission, which I chair, which has also been sanctioned, pouring abuse over the head of Hong Kong Watch, for example. This happens all the time. What we're particularly concerned about, though, is those Uyghurs and Tibetans that are in this country or elsewhere that we have associated with in confidence, whose families have then been contacted, or threats emanating out of China to the families of dissidents back at home as well. And they, as we put in the statement, where we have the most concern, it's caused quite a lot of inconvenience and an intimidation for us, but that's nothing compared with those braver people who are in the front line.
And you'll notice that some of the people that work here have been named in the case against Jimmy Lai quite wrongly, which is an outrage, and of course it's an outrageous prosecution in the first place. But we had also a spy investigation, which is still ongoing. We've also had an individual that was working with somebody who the intelligence services felt was a spy, who was actually wandering around the building. At that time, we were dealing with a lot of Hong Kong people trying to get out, so we had lots of documents on them in our desks, on our desks and things. So, you know, the truth is we are too, and have been, too wide open.
And on that comparison with the 1930s?
Yeah, well, the point I was making, of course, is what does it teach you about when you try and please those that you think are threatening? The answer is they get more threatening. And that's what appeasement teaches us. There are some parallels, but I'm not trying to reach back and say we're in exactly the same boat. I'm simply saying the lesson is stand up, be clear to yourself, be clear what matters to you as a country, say it out loud, and let the others deal with it.
And there has to be consequences, and the Chinese need to be convinced of those consequences, which they haven't been up to now.
So we'll go across one year later.
Hi, George Roberts from BBC Scotland. Can I ask you in particular, Stewart, on you have been critical of the First Minister of Scotland and his failure, as you see it, to de-risk relations with China. What's your message to him today?
Well, I'll be saying more on de-risking and Scotland in the coming weeks, actually. But when I say this affects every single part of our society, this is what I mean. And so often, devolution gets forgotten about. And I tell you, they don't forget about it in Moscow or in Beijing. They're highly alive to the fact that huge swathes of financial and legislative powers don't sit in London. But if I can be critical of the UK government as well, by the way, they have a 20th century view of what national security is. So it's not alive to either the modern way that our institutions of government are set up and the way in which they can be exploited. We take, as one example, the issue of universities. Our universities right across the UK, but in particular in Scotland, are massively over-dependent on money that comes from the Chinese state. If, God help us, we're in a situation where there is a conflict in Taiwan, or if there is an economic blockade of Taiwan and there are sanctions back and forward, and our universities fall subject to that, what happens then? So we do need to do what business is already doing, start having that national dialogue with all parts of society about the change we need to see. And I'm not saying this to be critical of anybody, I'm trying to help, because I think it's in all of our economic interests to get this right.
I've got to go. I'm going to make, for me, the last question, but my colleagues will stay because I have to go to the House of Commons.
You're saying call a threat a threat. Can we define exactly what the threat is? For people who are watching this who may be far from Westminster, they're not dissidents, they're not MPs, what exactly do they have to fear from China?
Well, we're dealing with not one country, by the way, we're dealing with an entity that is a aggressive and brutal regime that brooks no contravening arguments or debates, that has been known to arrest people under false pretenses, practices torture, practices genocide. What we are threatened with by this are a number of different things. First of all, as they grow in power and potency, what happens is we are shrinking before them. So we've talked about not just China, but what we call the axis of totalitarian states, China, North Korea, Russia, Iran. They all work in concert now. And because we haven't worked so closely in concert as we should have done, therefore they are making ground against us. Lots of undecided countries are beginning to move across to the China side of things, to the extremist side of things, and that's because of the Belt and Road and other projects they put together. So the West has to wake up to the fact this is a challenge to the very way that we live our lives, to our belief in democracy, human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of worship. These are the things that we hold dear, but we seem reluctant to want to defend those against the others who hold none of those virtues and values and want to take ours, as it were, from us. So although people don't think about it in the street, you know, good examples are when things are hidden, we don't get to know about them. I fall back personally on the basis of what happened during the COVID saga because of a lack of information, a lack of knowledge, a refusal to explain what was actually going on. There were huge problems that followed as a result, and we've seen how many people died. So all I say is, unless you're open, unless you are free, it's very difficult to manage your lives. And to that extent, we have to be very clear about those who are not.
Anyone? Do you want to take?
Yeah, you take
one
that.
last
I'll
one?
take you, then I must dash after that.
Thank you very much. McDonald from the Daily Express. With two major elections coming up this year, are you concerned about any interference from Beijing in those general elections, the US election?
Yes, and so that's again a very important question for ministers today. The government has been wise to this. They've set up the Defending Democracy task force. In fact, we had a briefing from them with other IPAC members who met last week. So the government is doing quite a lot of work to try and prevent that sort of incursion. But we know that's the way China acts. We've got to be ever vigilant. We hope the statement today is just going to increase the government's ongoing vigilance, because China has many, I've always described it as having many tentacles in very many different areas, be it in our schools, our university campuses, in our boardrooms, in our local authorities, in businesses. But absolutely, they are in the business of trying to influence elections and democracies as well. And given that over 40% of the world's democracies are going to the polls this year, including some of the largest democracies, we all need to be vigilant. It's not just the UK.
I must go, I'm afraid, without this question, but I'll leave it to...
All right, should we just take the gentleman at the back, and then we'll take you, sir, and then...
Thank
Yep.
you. This is Lyndon from VOA. So my question is about university campus. So I think a few months ago, there's a student testifying in Parliament about the threat he faced from Chinese government while he was being a dissident at University of York campus. And when he was protesting with the Hong Kong flag during his graduation ceremony, the uni switched off the camera and live streaming and called his action being disturbing to other people because the flag had different symbolism. And in response to my media request, they were also quite hostile as well. And I believe we live in a democracy, and I'm sure the Parliament cannot tell the academic institution what to do. But what do you think the Parliament can do to protect the dissent in this soil from the Chinese government harassment?
Stewart will take that.
Well, the example you mentioned I'm familiar with, but it's not the only one. I mean, I remember meeting some students from Hong Kong at universities in Scotland talking about this exact issue. They are harassed, they are intimidated, and universities need to step up their game to not just protect them, but to defend them as well. And I think the fact that we're not seeing that is deeply disturbing. The question has to be asked of each institution, why? And, bear in mind this is happening. To go back to the earlier question about, what is the threat? This is the contest of the open and the closed society. This is how it manifests itself on universities, in our economy, in our energy systems, in our parliament, in our democracy. And I think that contest is something we have to fight in, because what we don't want to get to a situation is where we see what's happening in Ukraine happening elsewhere. So we must defend the open institutions that universities are, the students who are at them, especially those who've come here from Hong Kong.
In answer to what the government's doing about it, we've had to pass legislation about freedom of expression and freedom of speech on university campuses. There is serious concern that when there are so many Chinese students here who are welcome to be here, but many of them in the pay and subsidised by the Chinese government, they are informing on other Chinese students and effectively being paid to be advocates for the Chinese government as well. And where you've got universities, in some cases, relying for as much as 28-30% of their revenue from Chinese students, how much is that going to influence their attitudes towards being critical of China and the way they operate? Final question we had, sir, yes.
Chris McKeon, PA. In the past week, I think some of your parliamentary colleagues were in Beijing for the 12th annual China-UK Leadership Forum, meeting with various CCP figures, including the head of their international liaison department. Should they have done this?
Well, that is for them. We, of course, can't visit China, not that we're missing out on much
I think I can.
there.
You
can. You're not technically sanctioned, but those of us who are sanctioned can't. I think we've made this point before, and we lobbied the Speaker to prevent the Chinese ambassador and senior Chinese government officials being able to access the Palace of Westminster. It seemed absurd that when 7 parliamentarians were sanctioned from going to China on the basis of speaking up and doing our job and being critical of human rights abuses by the Chinese government, that we were readily allowing the Chinese ambassador to come to Parliament and use the mother of democracies as a platform for the Chinese government. So I think our view would be for other parliamentarians to go to China at a time when their colleagues remain sanctioned is not helpful and not appropriate, but it's for them to answer for that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry about the shifting times and everything, but obviously there's quite a lot happening, and the statement's going to be at 3:30 from Oliver Dowden. If anything further comes out of that, we will put out a written statement from all those who are sanctioned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Heading back over.
Yeah.
Do you want that?
Right. Yes. We may need to put up some more comments depending on what, if those 4 questions are not answered. Thanks, sir. Then we can respond to that.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll draw something that's just a bit down.
Yeah.
The other thing is that there are quite a few people who want interviews.